They thought they were just stopping an old, rusty van on a forgotten road. But minutes later, a government minivan pulled up, and what happened next changed the town forever. The man sitting silently on the curb wasn't just another driver. He was a hidden hero whose story had been buried for decades. The midday sun burned mercilessly over the fields and cracked asphalt outside Huntsville, Alabama in July 2014. The air shimmered with heat waves, blurring the distant outlines of barns and telephone poles. A battered Ford Econoline van rumbled down the deserted country road, its engine coughing slightly with every dip in the uneven pavement. Dust swirled in its wake, coating the road and roadside weeds in a fine, dry layer of earth. Behind the worn steering wheel sat an elderly man with silver hair, his face weathered and tanned from decades under open skies. His eyes, though half hidden beneath the brim of a faded baseball cap, remained alert, scanning the road with a patient, steady gaze. He wore a threadbare work jacket with Wilson carpentry stitched across the chest, the fabric thinned to softness by countless days of labor. His hands, thick with calluses and scars, gripped the wheel with a calm firmness born from habit rather than urgency. On the back seat, unsecured but neatly stacked, lay planks of lumber, old metal tools, and a battered toolbox, all carefully balanced despite the van's constant jolts and rattles. The vehicle itself was a relic of another era, its once white paint faded to a dull, grayish cream, its body dented and scratched by years of heavy use. Yet, like its driver, it still moved forward with quiet determination. Without warning, the stillness was shattered by flashing red and blue lights reflected in the dusty rearview mirror. A patrol cruiser, gleaming and spotless, appeared behind the van, signaling for it to pull over. The van slowed, tires crunching over the gravel shoulder before coming to a halt in a small clearing beside the road. Two young police officers emerged from the cruiser, adjusting their mirrored sunglasses as they approached. Their crisp uniforms and confident strides stood in stark contrast to the worn figure waiting behind the wheel. One officer, tall and broad-shouldered, circled the van slowly, eyeing its dented panels and rusted edges with open disdain. The second, younger and thinner, leaned slightly forward, peering into the cab with a skeptical frown. To them, the scene was familiar. An old man in a broken-down vehicle on a neglected stretch of highway, far from town. Likely a vagrant. Perhaps someone running from unpaid fines or worse. Their posture suggested not caution, but a kind of casual superiority, the ease of those who believed they already knew the story before a single word had been spoken. Dust clung to their boots as they moved closer, the heavy heat pressing down on the moment, stretching it thin. The old man did not move. His hands remained visible on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable beneath the lined features of his face. The officers glanced at each other briefly, already making unspoken judgments. In the stillness of the dusty afternoon, the balance of power seemed clear. To them, at least, they had no idea who sat before them. The two officers approached the driver's side window with a slow, deliberate swagger, their steps raising small puffs of dust from the dry shoulder. One officer tapped on the glass with the knuckle of his hand, motioning for the man inside to lower it. Without hesitation, the old man complied, cranking the window down manually with a creak that spoke of years of wear. The taller officer immediately pointed out the missing license plates and the long crack spidering across the windshield. His partner took a few steps back to examine the rear of the van, shaking his head with an exaggerated gesture of disbelief. The van, in their eyes, was a moving violation waiting to happen, and the man inside it nothing more than a symbol of negligence or worse. Silently, the driver reached into his worn jacket pocket and retrieved a faded leather wallet. From it, he produced an aged driver's license, the edges curled and the lettering slightly worn from years of use. He handed it over without a word, his eyes calm, his movements slow and deliberate. The name printed on the license was George Wilson, born 78 years ago, a lifetime carried in a small weathered piece of plastic. The officers glanced at the ID, exchanging a quick smirk between them. To them, the name meant nothing, just another citation to process, another face to forget by the end of their shift. Without offering any courtesy, they ordered George out of the vehicle. He obeyed immediately, pushing the creaky door open and stepping out with a measured dignity, placing his hands behind his back, palms clasped, as if standing once again on some long-forgotten military parade ground. One officer began rifling through the interior of the van, moving the tools and papers with rough, careless hands. Wrenches clattered to the floor. Loose nails spilled from a dented coffee can. Amid the clutter, he uncovered a battered green jacket draped over the front seat. It was heavy with embroidered patches, frayed along the sleeves but meticulously cared for otherwise. Alongside it, tucked in a side pocket, rested a small silver medallion bearing the emblem of the United States Air Force, dulled by time but unmistakable in its design. The officer barely glanced at the items before tossing them aside atop the mess of wood scraps and worn-out tarps. He saw no significance in them, no weight in their history. To him, they were nothing more than the dusty belongings of an old man clinging to memories. George stood beside the vehicle, his boots planted firmly in the gravel, his posture unnervingly straight under the heavy Alabama sun. He said nothing as the officers continued their search, said nothing as they laughed quietly between themselves, making offhand remarks he chose not to hear. His silence was not one of confusion or fear, but of endurance, the silence of someone who had faced far worse than idle disrespect. The seconds stretched long and thin, the hum of cicadas filling the gaps between the officers' movements. The road remained empty, save for the slow passage of distant cars whose drivers barely spared a glance for the scene unfolding at the side of the highway. To the officers, George Wilson was just another old man with a broken van and no visible place in the world they thought they knew. They could not see the weight of history etched into his every line, nor hear the echoes of engines from distant battlefields woven into the silent resilience of his stance. Their eyes, trained to judge quickly and act even faster, missed everything that truly mattered. The heat pressed down from the sky with a merciless weight, turning the cracked asphalt into a griddle that radiated upward in shimmering waves. The dry, acrid smell of sunburned tar filled the air, clinging to everything with a stifling intensity. The air itself seemed to quiver, and even the distant tree lines appeared to waver under the relentless sun. George sat on the curb, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The officers had ordered him there without a second thought, treating the elderly man like a common offender rather than someone worthy of even basic courtesy. The concrete beneath him was blisteringly hot, searing through the fabric of his work pants, but he made no sign of discomfort. His knees, battered by years of hard labor and old injuries, throbbed with a dull ache, yet he refused to shift or fidget. His composure remained unbroken, a quiet defiance in the face of humiliation. Cars passed by on the highway, some slowing briefly as drivers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the scene. A few held up their phones, casually recording the sight of an old man being detained on the side of the road. No one stopped to ask questions. No one intervened. To passing eyes, it was just another traffic stop in the middle of nowhere, another day under the southern sun. The officers, standing a few feet away, alternated between peering into the computer in their patrol car and discussing possible charges in low, indifferent voices. They considered ticketing George for multiple violations, lack of visible plates, unsafe vehicle condition, expired registration. Their tone was casual, almost bored, as if processing an inconvenience rather than handling a human being with a lifetime of unseen stories. Time dragged, stretched by the heat and the monotony. Sweat trickled down George's temples, soaked into the collar of his shirt and dried again almost instantly. His breath was slow and steady, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the road, far beyond the small crowd of heat waves rising from the pavement. He was not truly present in that moment. His mind, like a well-worn compass, had shifted to places long past but never forgotten. In the depths of his memory, George stood once more on the tarmac of a sweltering airbase in Vietnam, the engine roar of C-130S filling the sky, the urgency of evacuation missions pounding in his veins. He recalled the suffocating humidity of Laotian jungles, the desperate cries of wounded soldiers needing airlift under enemy fire, the calculated patience required to survive in the midst of chaos. The discipline forged in those crucibles now anchored him against the petty indignities of this roadside interrogation. He sat motionless while an hour bled away, each minute grinding slowly forward. Around him, the world remained oblivious to the quiet fortitude it took to endure without anger, to wait without lashing out, to trust that dignity was not something anyone else could strip away. George Wilson, seated on a strip of forgotten highway, remained a soldier at heart, enduring yet another battle, one fought not with weapons, but with patience and unshakable pride. The dry, shimmering silence of the roadside was broken by the low, steady hum of an approaching vehicle. A light gray minivan, its paint glinting softly under the unforgiving Alabama sun, rolled up slowly, coming to a precise halt a few yards away from the patrol cars. Its government-issued plates gleamed unmistakably in the harsh daylight, immediately drawing the attention of everyone present. The driver's door opened with a quiet click, and a large man stepped out, moving with a deliberate, unhurried confidence. He wore a crisp, light-colored shirt, neatly tucked into pressed beige trousers, his belt buckle shining faintly. His posture was impeccable, his shoulders squared and his back straight, a lifetime of military discipline evident in every movement. In his left hand, he carried a dark leather portfolio, thick with documents, clasped with the care of someone accustomed to handling matters of serious consequence. Without glancing around for approval or acknowledgement, he closed the door and began walking toward the scene. His strides were even and controlled, exuding an air of authority that seemed to ripple outward, shifting the energy of the gathered crowd. His presence was not loud or ostentatious. It was the quiet, undeniable command of a man who had long ago ceased needing to prove himself. On the sidelines, a few curious bystanders had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual spectacle unfolding on an otherwise empty road. Some recognized the newcomer immediately, whispering among themselves, recalling televised town halls and veterans' commemorations where he had spoken with solemn grace. His name, though not shouted, passed from one pair of lips to another. Colonel Michael Davis, retired, now a prominent advisor on veterans' affairs for the state. The two officers, sensing a shift they could not yet name, straightened their posture reflexively, a subconscious response to the sudden gravity settling over the scene. Their casual demeanor began to fray at the edges, replaced by a tension they neither welcomed nor understood. Colonel Davis moved past the small gathering without hesitation, his gaze locked first on the figure seated on the curb. George Wilson remained motionless, framed against the heat-rippled pavement, his face impassive, his body still radiating a quiet endurance. The colonel's eyes softened almost imperceptibly at the sight, a recognition of a kindred spirit forged through shared decades of silent sacrifice. Shifting his attention, Davis turned to the officers. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with a sternness born of deep principle. In his mind, he already pieced together the scene without needing a single word spoken. The posture of the old man, the casual contempt of the officers, the heat, the isolation, it was all clear. No ceremony would be necessary, no drawn-out explanations. The truth lay bare in the dust between them. Gripping the leather folder firmly under one arm, Colonel Davis prepared to do what he had done countless times before: stand between ignorance and dignity, and ensure that the measure of a man was not decided by his appearance, but by the legacy written in the lines of his life. The heat no longer seemed to press quite so heavily as more townspeople trickled toward the scene, curiosity drawing them like moths to a flame. The small crowd formed a loose semicircle around the patrol cars and the solitary figure of George Wilson. Some shaded their eyes with their hands, others leaned against their vehicles, whispering quietly among themselves, unsure whether they were witnessing a confrontation or something much more profound. Colonel Davis stood in the center of the growing assembly, his voice steady and clear, slicing through the thick afternoon air. Without raising it, he commanded the attention of everyone within earshot. With deliberate calmness, he began to speak of George Wilson's life, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a recitation of facts that deserved acknowledgement. He told of a man who, at 78 years old, still spent his days building wheelchair ramps and repairing homes for disabled veterans and elderly neighbors, asking for no payment beyond a handshake and a thank you. He recounted how, in the aftermath of the devastating 2011 tornadoes that had torn through northern Alabama, George had almost single-handedly restored 27 houses, working from sunrise to sunset for people he barely knew. His hands, calloused and scarred, had rebuilt shattered lives alongside splintered wood and broken shingles. As Davis spoke, the murmuring among the bystanders grew. Heads turned, Glances exchanged. Recognition began to ripple through the crowd. Someone pointed quietly, remembering how their own grandfather had received a ramp for his wheelchair after a stroke. Another leaned in and recalled how the roof of their aunt's house, left gaping after a storm, had been repaired by a silent stranger who refused to take a dime. Faces softened as pieces of a larger picture began to fall into place. The two young officers, who only moments ago stood tall and self-assured, now shifted uncomfortably. Their posture sagged slightly under the weight of what they were hearing. Their earlier smirks and offhand laughter were replaced by uneasy glances toward George, who remained motionless, his eyes still fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. The realization crept slowly over them that their assumptions had blinded them not just to a man's history, but to his very humanity. They had seen an old, broken van and a silent driver. They had failed to see the lifetime of service, sacrifice, and quiet resilience that had shaped the man seated before them. Every battered tool, every frayed jacket, every wrinkle on George Wilson's face told a story they had been too impatient to hear. In that moment, on a dusty roadside outside Huntsville, the gap between appearance and reality stretched wide and undeniable. The crowd stood in silent witness as truth, long buried beneath years of humble labor and unspoken deeds, finally emerged into the harsh light of an Alabama afternoon. The next morning, the story swept through Huntsville like wildfire. Local newspapers featured it on their front pages, with headlines recounting the quiet strength and long-forgotten heroism of George Wilson. Social media buzzed with photos and videos captured by bystanders, portraying not an arrest, but a moment of profound revelation. In living rooms, cafes, and barbershops, people spoke his name with newfound respect, piecing together stories they had once heard in passing, but never connected. Moved by the overwhelming response, the city council convened in an emergency session. Without hesitation, they voted unanimously to bestow upon George Wilson the title of Honorary Citizen of Huntsville, a distinction reserved for only the most selfless contributors to the community. Plans were made for a public ceremony to honor him properly, with the mayor scheduled to present the symbolic key to the city in a grand event at the town square. When the day of the ceremony arrived, the square was filled with banners, folding chairs, and rows of curious townspeople. Veterans in uniform, school children with hand-drawn signs, and reporters with cameras lined the edges of the plaza. Yet as the mayor stepped up to the podium and proudly called George's name, the stage remained empty. Far from the noise and fanfare, George spent that morning as he did countless others. In the quiet outskirts of town, he worked steadily in the shade of his modest garage, repairing a battered pickup for a neighbor who could no longer afford the cost of a new vehicle. His life, anchored in service rather than ceremony, continued without pause or pretense. He accepted the recognition not through applause or speeches, but through the satisfaction of a job well done. Meanwhile, the two young officers who had once dismissed him with careless arrogance began to walk a different path. At first, hesitantly, and then with greater conviction, they volunteered for community service programs focused on veterans' assistance. They learned to build ramps, repair roofs, and install handrails, working alongside men and women whose stories etched humility into every nail they hammered. Through months of sweat, shared meals, and quiet conversations, they came to understand what George Wilson had taught them without ever speaking a word. That respect was not something granted based on appearances, but earned through action. That true strength was measured not by authority, but by the willingness to serve without expectation of reward. The transformation spread beyond two men. Inspired by George's story, the citizens of Huntsville rallied together to fund the construction of a new community center dedicated to supporting local veterans. Donations poured in, from small businesses and retirees, from school fundraisers and anonymous benefactors. By the following spring, a modest but sturdy building stood proudly near the town's heart. Its walls painted a warm, welcoming shade of blue. On its front facade, above the entrance, a simple bronze plaque was mounted. No grand sculpture, no towering monument, just a few plain words engraved into the metal. In honor of George Wilson, a man who taught us to build more than houses, but bridges between people. And so, in the rhythms of daily life, in every ramp built, every roof repaired, every stranger greeted with a little more patience, George Wilson's legacy endured, not through fame or fortune, but through the steady, unseen work of a community that had, at last, learned to see its quiet heroes.